The movie today opens a century ago in an old mansion. A butler is pleading with a woman named Emmeline, telling her to feed as she has confined herself to her room for so long. Emmeline, a vampire, runs from her room and finds a rope to tie around her neck, and she uses a statue as weight to ensure that she would be beheaded when she hangs herself. And her plan works, and she's instantly beheaded. Enter Evie, a typical 21st century New Yorker who's a ceramic artist by day and a catering freelancer by night. She, along with her friend Grace, are working a gig as servants at an event. After their shift ends, Grace gives Evie a bag from the organizer that contains a DNA test kit. Evie heads home to her apartment where she practices her talent. She listens to a voice message from her mother who died a year ago and takes the DNA test and sends her sample to the company. Later, she finds out that she has a distant cousin, a British man named Oliver, and she meets up with him. Oliver tells Evie that she's a product of a scandal, and he goes on to tell her about her grandma Emmeline, who had an affair and gave birth to her grandfather. Oliver then invites Evie to a wedding in England, telling her that he will pay for her trip, and a clueless Evie accepts. Evie then arrives in London and heads to Deville Estate with Oliver. While trying to take a photo of the license plates because Grace told her to, she bumps into Dia. She causes her to drop a box of glasses, and as she was helping Dia clean up, a snarky butler named Mr. Fields arrives at the scene and demands the mess be cleaned up. Evie doesn't like his attitude, and as she's building up an altercation, Walter, the lord of the estate, arrives to save the day. He sends the butler away, and as he starts a pleasant conversation with Evie, Oliver arrives. He introduces Walter as the lord of the estate to Evie, who didn't know that yet, and Evie is visibly impressed. Walter leaves and Mr. Field takes Evie to her room. There she meets Mrs. Swift, who is her maid. Evie is feeling comfy on her bed when Walter knocks at Evie's door. He explains that he came to apologize and proceeds to flirt with her. Later that night, Evie is awakened from a nightmare, and she gets up to get something to drink. As she's walking through the halls, she sees Mr. Field, who has lined up some maids in the hall as they wait to be picked to clean the library. The bell from the library rings twice, and Mr. Fields instructs maid number 2 to clean the library. Evie leaves as Mr. Fields sends the maid into the room and promptly starts praying. The maid starts to clean the library, but is turned into an easy prey by a vampire. The next morning, Evie meets with the rest of her new family. The great uncle of the family gives her a welcoming speech. Evie then checks with Oliver that Walter and her are not related. In the next scene, Mr. Fields sends Dia and another maid down into the wine cellar and shuts the door. And soon, they are picked up by 2 vampires. Walter buys Evie a dress which she wears for a ball that evening. As she arrives at the ball, Mr. Fields announces her and she is welcomed with a loud applause. The maids of honor, Victoria and Lucy, arrive at the ball and they are met by the same applause. They head straight to Evie and start a conversation, and Victoria reveals herself to be the condescending one while Lucy is the nice one. Walter arrives to an applause and he too heads straight to Evie to have his first dance with her. Walter takes Evie to his art room where they talk about how they're both orphans in Evie's words. They then share a kiss while watching the fireworks, and Victoria watches the 2 kiss from outside. Later, as Evie is sleeping in her room, she's awakened by a distant voice. She sees someone or something creeping inside her room, and she hides under her bed, and Walter finds her and reassures her that there's nobody else in her room. He then offers to stay in her room until she falls asleep, and she agrees. She falls asleep as Walter is pouring his heart out about what he wants in life. The next morning, Victoria and Lucy invite Evie to a pampering session. Evie, still clueless, talks about how she's excited to finally meet the bride and the groom. And accidentally, the manicurist working on Evie cuts her finger and it bleeds, and Victoria approaches her and starts to suck her blood from the finger. And this really freaks Evie out and she leaves. On her way back to her room, she decides to enter the forbidden library. There, she finds that Walter has been stalking her, having printed out the DNA test results along with her Facebook profile. Later, as Evie was back in her room packing her stuff, Walter walks in and convinces her that he only had those files because he wanted to make sure that she was coming to his estate, not looking for his money. They then all of a sudden, make love on her bed, and while they were on the bed, chatting after the fun, Walter suggests that they get married. Thinking that he was joking, of course, Evie accepts, and as Walter was leaving, Evie asks him if he knew that she was joking, but Walter simply smiles and leaves. Later, at the rehearsal dinner, Walter and the three families wait impatiently for Evie to arrive. Walter warmly greets her and proceeds to formally welcome the three families, the Klopstocks, Billingtons, and Alexanders. The festivities begin, and Evie asks Walter where the bride and groom are. Walter then begins to give a speech on which he talks about how the bond between him and the three families have been weakened due to the absence of Emmeline. He continues to say that the bond will once again be fortified now that he and Evie will be wed. And the room erupts in applause as Evie, confused, asks Walter what's going on while he orders refreshments. The refreshment arrives carrying a bowl which she puts down on the table, only to have her throat slit by Mr. Fields and her blood poured into the same bowl that she brought. Evie is horrified as she realizes that these people are vampires. Mr. Fields pours the blood from the bowl onto a glass and presents it to Walter, Lucy, and Victoria. Walter explains that the three mortal families have each provided brides for him, the two families provided Victoria and Lucy, and that Evie is a replacement for the Alexander's bride, who was Emmeline. The three families receive safety and prosperity in return, and Walter tells the still shook Evie that she brought life to these four walls. Evie tries to leave, but she is stopped by the guards. She starts begging them, and she tells Walter that she wants to go home, and then she begs the families to help her, and she calls them monsters and starts frantically knocking at the door, at which Walter comes and tells her to stop embarrassing him. He then tells Victoria and Lucy that Evie is theirs tonight, but tomorrow she is his. Victoria and Lucy take Evie to the cellar where they explains that their bloodlines are rare and when combined, it makes them all powerful. Lucy then tells Evie that she's only been Walter's wife for only 100 years, but Victoria has been his wife for 500 years. She explains that at the wedding, Evie must drink Walter's blood, which will make her a vampire, and then he will drink her blood, which will grant them eternal life. Meanwhile, Dea is chained up in the cellar with them, and when Victoria was about to drink her blood, Evie begs her to stop, which prompts Victoria to call the servants to prepare Dea for the wedding ceremony. Victoria then throws Evie into a coffin and hammers it shut. Later, Mrs. Swift breaks the coffin open and frees Evie and tells her that she's helping her because she felt guilty over what happened to Emmeline. And she also tells her the 3 ways to kill a vampire. And Mrs. Swift stays behind for no reason whatsoever while Evie runs out of the estate, and she gets killed by Mr. Field, and Evie runs to a nearby town where she meets an elderly couple in a shop. Evie asks for their help and they let her in, and while the woman was on the phone, Evie realizes that she works for Walter when she sees an old picture of her at his estate. Having finished the call, the woman tells Evie that they are on their way, and Evie tries to run, but the woman knocks her out. She wakes up in Walter's study beside an unconscious maid, and Walter tells her that he's known as the son of the dragon. Or to put it simply, Dracula. He goes on to explain the benefits of being a vampire, but Evie answers him with a spit to his face. And in that moment, the maid beside her wakes up and she starts crying, and to shut her up, Walter starts to suck her blood. And seeing this, Evie faints. In the next scene, we surprisingly see Evie walking down the aisle and kneeling beside Walter to take her vows. She gives her consent to the marriage, and the officiant announces that they may now exchange blood. Walter cuts open his wrists, and Evie drinks his blood rather vigorously, and she finally becomes a vampire. Walter wanted to drink from Evie too, but she leaves him kneeling, saying that she first wants to drink from Dea. Dea was already tied up waiting to be feasted on, and instead of actually feasting on her, Evie suddenly throws the lit candles at the officiant, which lights him on fire, and the entire room as well, and then she stabs Walter through the heart as he was rushing to her. She frees Dea and tries to escape, but she gets tackled down by Victoria. Victoria reveals that Walter isn't dead, as she wouldn't still be a vampire if he was. She then starts to dominate Evie, but Lucy comes to her aid. And as Victoria and Lucy start fighting, the younger Lucy overpowers the old and frail Victoria and pushes them both into a spear, and they turn to dust. Mr. Fields then appears out of nowhere and tries to stab Evie with a spear, but realizing her vampire powers, Evie breaks off the spear's head and she stabs him in the chest. She's then chased by a wall-crawling Walter who catches up and grabs her by the throat. He goes on to complain about how modern women are so ungrateful, but then Evie uses a cutting wire to cut Walter's wrist off. He tries to rush at her, but she kicks him back into the flames. Evie then loses her vampire powers as Walter screeches to death in the fire. She leaves the fire-engulfed mansion in a typical Hollywood hero exit, and 2 weeks later, Evie is in London with Grace, who have tracked down Oliver. Oliver thought that he could flee as he's paid off the police, but he doesn't know that the Grim Reapers are about to knock on his door. And that is where our awesome movie today ends. I hope you guys enjoyed this recap. Make sure to leave me a like, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel. I love you guys so much, and I promise to see you on my next recap.